Welcome to Hidden Truths. Picture this. You're sitting at Thanksgiving dinner, being called a gold digger by your husband's entire family, watching them tear apart everything you've built together, when suddenly, the doorbell rings. The man who walks through that door doesn't just change the conversation, he changes everything they thought they knew about you. Because sometimes, the people who judge you the loudest are the ones who know you the least. And sometimes, the truth arrives exactly when you need it most. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where it all began. The Riverside Estate sat perched on the hills of Maplewood like a crown jewel. Its wraparound porches and towering oak trees screaming old money. I'd driven up this winding driveway dozens of times over the past 3 years, but today felt different. Today, the weight of their stairs felt heavier, the whispers louder, the smiles more forced than ever before. My name is Cassandra Wells. Well, Cassandra Ashford now, and I was about to endure what would become the most humiliating and transformative Thanksgiving of my life. I adjusted my simple black dress in the rearview mirror, the same one I'd worn to my job at the community center that morning. Even on holidays, someone had to check on the elderly residents who had nowhere else to go. My husband, Nathaniel, always said it was one of the things he loved most about me, my dedication to helping others. His family, however, saw it very differently. The moment I stepped out of my modest Honda Civic, a car that looked painfully out of place next to the lineup of BMWs, Mercedes, and Teslas, I could feel the judgment radiating from the grand windows above. Through the glass, I caught glimpses of pearls, silk scarves, and pressed slacks. The Ashford family Thanksgiving wasn't just dinner. It was a performance, a display of wealth and status that I had never quite learned to appreciate. Nathaniel met me at the front door, his usual warm smile strained around the edges. "You look beautiful," he whispered, pressing a quick kiss to my cheek. Ready for this? I wasn't. I never was. But I nodded anyway, squeezing his hand as we walked into the foyer, with its crystal chandelier and marble floors that probably cost more than most people's annual salaries. "Cassandra, darling!" Nathaniel's mother, Vivian Ashford, glided toward us with the grace of someone who'd been practicing social etiquette since birth. Her embrace was perfectly timed, long enough to appear warm, brief enough to maintain boundaries. "How lovely that you could join us. I hope you didn't have to work too hard at that little center of yours today." The way she said center made it sound like a hobby, something quaint and temporary that I'd eventually outgrow once I learned to appreciate the finer things in life. I'd been running the Sunrise Community Center for 5 years, had increased their funding by 200%, and had personally helped over 300 families get back on their feet. But to Vivian, it was just that little center. "The residents needed someone today," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Mrs. Patterson is 94 and doesn't have any family. I couldn't leave her alone on Thanksgiving." Vivian's smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. "How charitable of you." The dining room was a masterpiece of autumn elegance. Golden linens, crystal stemware, and a centerpiece that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Around the mahogany table sat the entire Ashford clan. Nathaniel's father, Frederick, with his permanently skeptical expression, his sister Priscilla and her investment banker husband Montgomery, his brother Reginald and his wife Cordelia, who'd inherited more money than she'd ever spent, and scattered cousins, aunts, and uncles who all shared the same suspicious glances when they thought I wasn't looking. I took my usual seat next to Nathaniel, directly across from Priscilla, who had the uncanny ability to make every conversation feel like a cross-examination. As Frederick carved the turkey with ceremonial precision, the small talk began. Stock portfolios, property investments, charity galas where the real charity was networking with other wealthy families. "So, Cassandra," Priscilla began, her voice carrying that particular tone that always made my stomach clench. "Nathaniel mentioned you've been looking at some properties recently." I felt Nathaniel's hand tighten on mine under the table. We had been house hunting, looking for something bigger than our current two-bedroom apartment. Nothing extravagant, just a place where we could maybe start a family someday. We've been exploring our options, I replied carefully. Of course you have, Cordelia chimed in, her laugh like breaking glass. Though I have to say, it's fascinating how quickly your tastes have evolved since marrying into the family. The room fell into one of those loaded silences that feels like standing on thin ice. I could sense the shift in energy, the way conversations paused at the end of the table as ears tuned in to our exchange.
"I'm not sure what you mean," I said, though my heart was already racing because I knew exactly what she meant. Priscilla leaned forward, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around her wineglass. "Oh, come now, Cassandra. We're all family here. We can speak plainly." She paused, savoring the moment like fine wine. "It's just that when you and Nathaniel first met, you were quite content with your simple life, weren't you? That tiny apartment, that economy car, that, humble job. And now, suddenly, you're interested in $500,000 homes and designer handbags." My face burned. The designer handbag she was referring to was a birthday gift from Nathaniel, something I'd protested against and had worn exactly twice because it felt too expensive, too foreign in my hands. "Priscilla," Nathaniel's voice carried a warning, but she was far from finished. "I'm simply observing," she continued, her voice dripping with false innocence, "how marriage has a way of expanding one's aspirations. Some might call it personal growth. Others might use different terminology." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to catch. Around the table, I watched faces change, some showing embarrassment at Priscilla's boldness, others nodding in subtle agreement. Frederick's knife paused mid-slice through the turkey, and Vivian's smile had frozen into something resembling a death mask. But it was Reginald who spoke the words that would shatter everything. "Let's just call it what it is," he said, setting down his fork with deliberate precision. "Gold digging. It's not exactly uncommon, and frankly, Cassandra, we're not blind. A community center worker who suddenly develops expensive tastes the moment she marries money? The pattern is rather obvious." The silence that followed was deafening. 23 pairs of eyes stared at me across that perfectly set table, waiting for my response, waiting to see if I would crumble or fight back. My hands trembled in my lap, and I felt smaller than I ever had in my entire life. And that's when the doorbell rang. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The doorbell's chime echoed through the dining room like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. But Vivian Ashford wasn't about to let this moment of family honesty be interrupted by an unexpected guest. "Whoever that is can wait," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. She turned to me with the kind of smile that could freeze water. "I think this conversation is long overdue, don't you, dear?" Frederick nodded in agreement, finally setting down his carving knife and folding his hands in front of him like a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. "Vivian's right. We've been diplomatic long enough." His pale blue eyes fixed on me with laser precision. "Cassandra, we're not naive people. We've seen this pattern before in our social circle." The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time, but Vivian waved dismissively toward the foyer. "The staff will handle it. This is more important." Montgomery, Priscilla's husband, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of someone watching a long-anticipated show. "I have to say, I admire the strategy," he said, swirling his wine. "Starting with the community center angle was brilliant. Nothing says I'm not after money like working with poor people for peanuts." My mouth fell open. Strategy? I've been working there since I even met Nathaniel. I have a degree in social work and Please, Cordelia interrupted with a laugh that sounded like nails on chalkboard. A social work degree? That's adorable. What did that cost? 30,000? 40? Nathaniel's watch costs more than your entire education. Nathaniel's face had gone red, and I could see the vein in his temple that always appeared when he was furious. That's enough, he said, his voice dangerously low. You're talking about my wife. Exactly, Frederick said, leaning forward. Your wife, which makes this our business too. Son, you're going to inherit a significant portion of this family's wealth someday. The Ashford legacy goes back 4 generations. We have a responsibility to protect what we've built. Vivian reached across the table and placed her perfectly manicured hand over Nathaniel's. Darling, we're not attacking her. We're protecting you. We've watched you change over the past 3 years. You used to be so practical, so focused on the family business. Now you're talking about buying houses for a woman who was perfectly content living in a studio apartment before she met you. It was not a studio, I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. It was a 1-bedroom. Reginald snorted. Oh, well, that changes everything. The 3rd ring of the doorbell was followed by a firm knock that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Vivian's jaw tightened in annoyance. For heaven's sake, where is the staff?
But she wasn't deterred from her mission. She turned back to me with renewed focus. Cassandra, let me be direct, since subtlety seems lost on you. We know exactly what you are. We've seen your type before. Pretty young women who target successful men. You start small, claim you don't want anything, make them feel like heroes for rescuing you from your humble circumstances. That's not, I started, but she held up a hand to silence me. Then comes the engagement ring that had to be perfect. The wedding that somehow cost 3 times the original budget. The designer clothes that you didn't ask for, but certainly didn't refuse. And now the house hunting, the talk of children, the gradual transition from your little charity job to full-time spending our son's money. Priscilla nodded sagely. It's textbook, really. I studied psychology at Princeton. The pattern is always the same. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing all the air out of my lungs. Every gift Nathaniel had insisted on giving me, every upgrade to our lifestyle that I'd initially protested, every moment of happiness I'd allowed myself to feel, they were turning it all into evidence of some calculated scheme. I never asked for any of those things, I managed to say, my voice breaking slightly. I told Nathaniel the ring was too expensive. I wanted a small wedding. I've kept working because I love my job. Of course you kept working, Montgomery said with a knowing smirk. That's part of the act. Keep the day job, maintain the humble image, all while slowly conditioning him to spend more and more. It's actually quite sophisticated. Frederick stood up from his chair, his imposing 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the table. Here's what's going to happen, Cassandra. You're going to sign a post-nuptial agreement that protects our family's assets. You'll agree to a financial settlement that reflects your actual contributions to this marriage. And if you truly love our son as much as you claim, you'll do it without a fight. The knocking at the front door had become more insistent, accompanied by what sounded like multiple voices, but Vivian was in full matriarch mode now. Nothing was going to stop her from handling what she saw as a threat to their family's legacy. We're not monsters, she said, her voice taking on a patronizing tone that somehow felt worse than outright cruelty. We understand that you've become accustomed to a certain lifestyle. We're prepared to be generous in our settlement offer. You could walk away from this marriage with more money than you've ever seen in your life. But if you fight us, Frederick added, his voice like granite, if you try to take us to court or make this ugly, well, let's just say we have resources you can't imagine. We know people, judges, lawyers, private investigators. We could make your life very, very difficult. Nathaniel had gone completely pale. Dad, you can't threaten her like that. "I'm not threatening anyone," Frederick replied calmly. "I'm simply explaining the realities of the situation. Your wife needs to understand that she's not dealing with some naive young man anymore. She's dealing with the Ashford family." The room felt like it was spinning. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of trying to fit into their world, 3 years of loving their son with everything I had. And this is what they really thought of me? Not a daughter-in-law, not even a person, just a threat to be managed, a problem to be solved. Cordelia raised her wine glass in a mock toast. "Here's to keeping it in the family." Literally. And that's when the front door opened and everything changed. The sound of the front door opening sent a ripple of irritation through the dining room, but the Ashford family was far from finished with their intervention. If anything, the interruption seemed to fuel their determination to settle this matter once and for all. "Whoever that is, they can wait in the parlor," Vivian said sharply, not even turning toward the sound of footsteps in the foyer. Her attention remained laser-focused on me, like a predator who had finally cornered her prey. I felt like I was drowning in plain sight. Every breath felt labored. Every heartbeat echoed in my ears like thunder. The faces around the table had transformed from the politely distant expressions I'd grown accustomed to into something far more sinister. Cold calculation mixed with barely concealed disgust. Priscilla pulled out her phone with deliberate slowness, the screen casting a blue glow across her face. "Actually, let's make this more concrete, shall we?" She scrolled through something with precision like a prosecutor presenting evidence. "I took the liberty of doing some research after your announcement."
"Did you know," she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "that our dear Cassandra here has quite an interesting financial history? Student loans that disappeared rather quickly after the wedding, a credit card debt that was mysteriously paid off around the same time Nathaniel started talking about helping with expenses." The room felt like it was tilting. Those debts, I'd been paying them off slowly, month by month, working double shifts at the community center and taking on weekend consulting jobs. Nathaniel had insisted on helping when he found out how much I was struggling, despite my protests. It had taken months of arguments before I'd finally accepted his help, and even then I'd made him promise to let me pay him back. "I offered to pay him back," I said, my voice barely audible. "I have a payment plan." "Oh, please," Montgomery interjected with a harsh laugh. "A payment plan? What was it, $50 a month? At that rate, you'd be paying him back until you're 90. Very convenient." Frederick leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. "But that's just the beginning, isn't it? There's also the matter of your career trajectory." I felt Nathaniel's hand squeeze mine under the table, but even his support felt fragile in the face of their united front. "What about my career?" I managed to ask. 3 years ago, you were making $32,000 a year, Frederick said, pulling out his own phone and reading from it like he was reciting statistics. "Today, you're the director of the Sunrise Community Center, making $65,000. That's quite a promotion for someone with such limited experience." The implication hit me like a physical blow. I earned that promotion. I increased their funding, expanded their programs. "Through connections," Cordelia said with a knowing smile. "Connections you gained by marrying into this family. The Ashford Foundation has donated significantly to your little center, hasn't it? How coincidental that your career suddenly flourished right around the time you gained access to our social circle." I felt sick. The Ashford Foundation had made donations to the center, but I'd had nothing to do with that. In fact, I'd specifically asked Nathaniel never to use his family's influence to help my work because I wanted to succeed on my own merits. But looking around the table now, I realized how naive that had been. In their world, everything was connected, everything had strings attached. "You're twisting everything," I said, my voice growing stronger with desperation.
I've worked 12-hour days for 5 years. I've given up weekends, holidays, vacations. I've slept in my office during budget crunches. I've held the hands of dying women who had no one else. That's not networking. That's my life." Reginald laughed, the sound sharp and cutting. "Oh, the martyr act! How original! Let me guess, you'll tell us next about all the personal sacrifices you've made, how you've given up so much for love." "Because I have!" The words burst out of me louder than I intended, causing several family members to lean back in surprise. "Do you have any idea what it's like to love someone whose family sees you as a virus to be eradicated? Do you know what it's like to spend 3 years walking on eggshells, trying to prove you're worthy of existing in the same room as them?" Vivian's expression didn't soften one bit. "If you feel that way, then perhaps you shouldn't be here." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. 3 years of family dinners, 3 years of trying to bond with these people, 3 years of bringing thoughtful gifts and remembering birthdays and asking about their lives. And this is what it had all meant to them? Nothing? Less than nothing? "You want to know what I sacrificed?" My voice shaking with emotion. "I turned down a job in Portland that would have paid me $80,000 a year because Nathaniel asked me to stay. I gave up my own apartment lease and moved in with him, even though I loved my independence. I've spent half my savings on clothes for your events because I was terrified of embarrassing him. I've smiled through 100 conversations about golf and stock portfolios and charity galas that cost more than most people make in a year." "All strategic moves," Montgomery said dismissively. "Classic long-term thinking." "Strategic?" I stood up so quickly that my chair scraped against the hardwood floor, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent room. "You think falling in love with someone was strategic? You think lying awake at night wondering if I'm good enough for him is strategic? You think crying in my car after every family gathering because I feel like an outsider is strategic?" For the first time, I saw a flicker of something. Uncertainty, discomfort, cross a few faces around the table. But Vivian remained unmoved.
"Tears are cheap, dear," she said coolly. "Performance emotion is one of the oldest tricks in the book. You're asking us to believe that a woman who grew up in a trailer park in Millfield somehow fell into a fairy tale romance with a man worth 8 figures purely by accident? The trailer park? She'd actually brought up the trailer park? I felt my face burn with shame and rage in equal measure. Yes, I'd grown up poor. Yes, my mother had worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat after my father left. Yes, I'd lived in a single-wide trailer for 6 years of my childhood. But I'd also graduated valedictorian from high school, earned a full academic scholarship to college, and built a career helping people who reminded me of where I came from." "You investigated my childhood?" I said, the words coming out flat and hollow. "We investigated everything," Frederick said, without a trace of apology. "Your family history, your financial records, your academic transcripts, your employment history, your medical records." "Medical records?" Nathaniel's voice cracked like a whip. "Dad, that's illegal." "Nothing's illegal when you have the right connections," Priscilla said with a shrug. "Though I have to say, the anxiety medication prescriptions were particularly interesting. Started right around the time you began dating our brother. Guilt, perhaps? The stress of maintaining a false identity?" I felt like I was going to vomit. The anxiety medication that had been prescribed after months of panic attacks triggered by exactly this kind of treatment from his family. I'd sought therapy because I'd started to believe their constant implications that I wasn't good enough, that I was somehow fundamentally flawed. And now they were using my attempts to get healthy as evidence of my guilt. "You're all sick," I whispered, sinking back into my chair. "You're actually sick." "We're protective," Vivian corrected, and were thorough, which brings us to our final point. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope, placing it on the table in front of me like a gauntlet being thrown down. Inside this envelope is a complete financial analysis of your relationship with our son. Every gift, every expense, every dollar that has flowed from the Ashford family to you over the past 3 years. The total might surprise you. My hands trembled as I stared at the envelope. I didn't want to know what was inside, but I couldn't look away. $1.7 million, Frederick said, his voice carrying the weight of a judge's verdict. That's how much you've cost this family, and that's just the direct expenses. If we factor in the opportunity costs, the business decisions Nathaniel has delayed or avoided because he's been distracted by this relationship. Stop, Nathaniel said, his voice barely controlled. Just stop. But they weren't stopping. They were just getting started. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear voices in the foyer growing louder, more insistent. But it felt like they were coming from another world, a world where people didn't dissect your entire existence over Thanksgiving dinner, where love wasn't treated like a business transaction gone wrong. The Ashford family had made their position clear. In their eyes, I wasn't a woman who had fallen in love. I was an investment that had failed to pay dividends, a mistake that needed to be corrected. And they were just getting started with the correction process. The manila envelope sat on the table like a loaded weapon, its contents promising to destroy whatever remained of my dignity. Frederick's words, $1.7 million, echoed in my head like a death sentence. Around the table, the Ashford family watched me with the satisfied expressions of hunters who had finally cornered their prey. "Open it," Vivian commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been denied anything in her life. "I think you'll find the itemized breakdown quite enlightening." My hands shook as I reached for the envelope. Inside, I could see the corner of what looked like a professional financial report, complete with charts and graphs. They actually hired someone to calculate the cost of loving their son. The absurdity of it might have been funny if it weren't so devastating. The engagement ring alone was $43,000, Priscilla said, reading from her own copy of the report with the enthusiasm of someone delivering particularly juicy gossip. Nathaniel originally looked at rings in the $15,000 range, but somehow, after several shopping trips with you, the price nearly tripled. I told him the first ring was perfect, I protested weakly. He's the one who insisted on upgrading it. Of course he did, Montgomery said, with a knowing smirk. I'm sure you had nothing to do with that decision. Just like you had nothing to do with the wedding venue changing from the country club to the Plaza Hotel. That little upgrade only cost an extra $60,000.
The memories of those decisions felt different now, tainted by their interpretation. I remembered protesting both changes, remembered feeling overwhelmed by the extravagance. But Nathaniel had been so excited, so insistent that his bride deserved the best. His enthusiasm had been infectious, and eventually I'd stopped fighting and started enjoying the fairy tale. Now I wondered if my enjoyment had been the trap all along. Then there's the honeymoon, Cordelia continued, her voice dripping with disdain. Originally planned for a week in Napa Valley, somehow became 3 weeks in Italy. Business class flights, 5-star hotels, private tours, another $35,000. Each item felt like a physical blow. Yes, the honeymoon had been extended. Yes, it had been more luxurious than anything I'd ever experienced. But Nathaniel had planned every detail himself, surprising me with each upgrade. I'd protested the extravagance, but he'd said he wanted to give me the world. How was I supposed to know that his family was keeping a running tally of every dollar? The apartment renovations, Reginald added, pulling out his own phone to read from what appeared to be a detailed spreadsheet.
$62,000 to upgrade a perfectly functional living space. New kitchen, new bathroom, new furniture, all because the existing accommodations weren't quite suitable for someone with your refined tastes. That renovation was Nathaniel's idea, too. He'd said our apartment felt like a bachelor pad and that we needed to make it feel like a home we'd built together. I'd loved picking out paint colors and furniture with him, had felt like we were building something real together. Now it felt like evidence in a trial I hadn't known I was facing. "Don't forget the car," Vivian said with particular venom. That Honda Civic was perfectly serviceable, but apparently not quite the image you wanted to project as an Ashford wife. The BMW cost $48,000. I wanted to scream. The Honda had been 15 years old and breaking down constantly. It had left me stranded twice in 1 month, once in a dangerous neighborhood at night. Nathaniel had been terrified for my safety and had insisted on replacing it. I'd argued for a used car, something practical and affordable. He had insisted on something reliable and safe, which in his world meant luxury. "We could go on," Frederick said, settling back in his chair with the satisfaction of a prosecutor who had just delivered a devastating closing argument. "The clothes, the jewelry, the weekend trips, the restaurants where a single meal costs more than most people spend on groceries in a month. It all adds up to a very expensive wife." The word expensive hit me like a slap. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of love and laughter and building a life together, reduced to a line item on a balance sheet. I felt smaller than I'd ever had in my life, like I was shrinking into nothing under the weight of their judgment. "But the real tragedy," Vivian continued, her voice taking on a tone of mock sympathy, "isn't the money. Money can be replaced. The real tragedy is what you've done to our son." She gestured toward Nathaniel, who sat frozen beside me, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. "Look at him, Cassandra. Really look at him. When was the last time he smiled the way he used to? When was the last time he talked about his dreams, his goals, his future with the family business?" I did look at him, and for the first time, I saw what they were seeing. The stress lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when we met. The way he'd been working longer hours, coming home exhausted and distracted. The gradual distance that had grown between him and his family, distance that I'd attributed to natural adult independence, but that they clearly blamed on my influence. "He used to call me every Sunday. We used to talk for hours about everything and nothing. Now I'm lucky if I get a 10-minute conversation every other week. He's missed family events, business meetings, opportunities that could have advanced his career, all because he's been so focused on managing your needs, your feelings, your constant demands for reassurance." The accusations felt like poison spreading through my veins. Had I been demanding? Had I monopolized his time and attention without realizing it? I thought about all the nights he'd stayed home with me instead of going to family dinners I felt too anxious to attend. All the business trips he'd shortened or canceled because I'd had panic attacks about being alone. All the times he's chosen me over them. "The saddest part," Priscilla added, her voice softer now but no less cutting, "is that I don't think you even realize what you've done. I think you genuinely believe you love him, but love doesn't isolate someone from their family. Love doesn't turn a confident, successful man into someone who constantly looks over his shoulder, wondering if he's doing enough to make his wife happy." Tears were streaming down my face now, and I didn't try to stop them. Maybe they were right. Maybe I had been selfish, needy, demanding. Maybe I had taken advantage of Nathaniel's generous nature without meaning to. Maybe I was everything they said I was, and I'd been too blind to see it. "We're not monsters," Frederick said, his voice gentler now, as if he could sense my breaking point. "We understand that you probably didn't set out to be manipulative. These things often start innocently enough. But the pattern is clear. And it's only going to get worse if we don't address it now. Montgomery nodded gravely. The longer this goes on, the more damage will be done. To Nathaniel, to the family, to you. Better to end things cleanly now, while there's still some dignity left for everyone involved. We've prepared a generous settlement offer, Vivian said, sliding a second envelope across the table. $200,000, tax-free. Enough to start over anywhere you want, pursue any career you choose. All we ask in return is a clean break and a non-disclosure agreement. $200,000. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. Enough to pay off every debt, buy a house, start my own nonprofit. All I had to do was walk away from the man I loved and pretend that the last 3 years had never happened. Think about it logically, Cordelia urged. You're 31 years old, you're attractive, educated, accomplished in your field. You could have a wonderful life with someone more suitable to your background. Someone who wouldn't come with all these complications. Someone poorer, I said, the words coming out as barely a whisper. Someone more compatible, Vivian corrected smoothly. Someone who shares your values, your experiences, your understanding of the world. Wouldn't that be better than spending the rest of your life feeling like an outsider, constantly judged and found wanting? The terrible thing was that part of it made sense. Part of me was so tired of fighting for acceptance, so exhausted from trying to prove myself worthy of love that didn't require a credit check. Maybe they were right. Maybe I would be happier with someone who didn't come with a family that saw me as a threat to be neutralized. I looked at Nathaniel, searching his face for some sign that he would fight for us, that he would stand up and tell his family they were wrong. But he just sat there, staring at his hands, looking like a man who was watching his entire world collapse and didn't know how to stop it. I need time to think, I whispered. Of course you do. It's a big decision. But I'm afraid we'll need an answer tonight. This has gone on long enough, and frankly, every day that passes makes things more complicated for everyone involved. That's when the voices in the foyer suddenly got much louder, and we heard the unmistakable sound of someone asking the staff where the dining room was located. The voice was deep, authoritative, and completely unfamiliar to me, but something about it made Frederick's face go very, very pale. The voice from the foyer grew closer, accompanied by what sounded like multiple sets of footsteps moving with purpose through the Ashford mansion. Whatever confidence the family had built during their systematic dismantling of my character began to waver as Frederick's face drained of color. "Who exactly did you invite tonight, Vivian?" he asked, his voice tight with a tension I'd never heard before. Vivian looked genuinely puzzled, her perfectly composed mask slipping for the first time all evening. "No one. The guest list was family only. You know that." The footsteps were getting closer now, moving through what sounded like the main hallway toward the dining room. I could hear a woman's voice, crisp, professional, speaking in what sounded like rapid-fire instructions to someone else. Then came that deep, authoritative voice again, clearer now as it approached. "Ma'am, I understand your concern about protocol, but this is a family matter that couldn't wait for normal business hours. Sometimes, situations require immediate attention." Priscilla grabbed her husband's arm, her knuckles white with tension. "Montgomery, do you recognize that voice? It sounds familiar, but I can't place it." Before Montgomery could answer, the dining room doors opened and everything changed. The first person through the door was a woman I'd never seen before. Tall, elegant, probably in her 50s, wearing an impeccably tailored navy suit that screamed expensive. Her silver hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from wielding real power. Behind her came two men in dark suits who were clearly security, followed by someone I couldn't see it. But it was the woman who commanded the room's attention. She surveyed the scene, the family frozen around the dinner table, the manila envelopes full of financial accusations, my tear-stained face, with the analytical gaze of someone who had walked into many rooms and quickly assessed the power dynamics at play. "Good evening," she said. her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone instinctively straighten in their chairs. "I apologize for the intrusion, but I believe there's been some confusion that needs to be addressed immediately." Frederick stood up slowly, his business instincts kicking in despite his obvious confusion. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've been introduced. This is a private family gathering, and—" "My name is Caroline Hartwell," the woman said, cutting him off with polite but absolute firmness. "I'm the senior managing partner at Hartwell Sterling and Associates." The name hit the room like a bomb. Hartwell Sterling and Associates was one of the most prestigious law firms in the country, the kind that represented Fortune 500 companies and billionaires in cases that made national headlines. Just mentioning their name was enough to make even the Ashfords pay attention. Vivian's composure cracked entirely. "I'm sure there's been some mistake. We haven't retained your services for anything, and certainly not for a family dinner." Caroline Hartwell smiled, but it wasn't a warm expression. "No, Mrs. Ashford, you haven't retained our services, but someone else has, and that someone else is here to address some serious misconceptions that apparently taken root in this room." She stepped aside, and the man who had been standing behind her moved into view. I had never seen him before in my life, but something about him was instantly familiar. He was probably in his early 60s, tall and lean with silver hair and the kind of bearing that suggested he was used to being the most important person in any room he entered. His suit was understated, but clearly custom-made, and he wore a watch that probably cost more than most people's cars. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. Pale blue, intelligent, and looking directly at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Hello, Cassandra," he said, his voice gentle despite the tension crackling through the room. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances, but I felt it was important to introduce myself properly." I stared at him, completely confused. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've met. I'm not sure who you are or why you're here." The man's smile was sad but warm. "My name is William Sterling. I'm your father." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually gasped, my hand flying to my chest as if I could somehow catch my breath before it escaped entirely. "That's impossible. My father left when I was 5. I haven't seen him since." "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And that's something I've regretted every single day for the past 26 years. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The room was so silent I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. Every member of the Ashford family was staring at this exchange with expressions ranging from confusion to growing horror as they began to piece together what this might mean. Caroline Hartwell stepped forward, consulting a tablet in her hands. "Perhaps I can clarify the situation for everyone. Mr. Sterling has been searching for his daughter for over 2 decades. When he learned about the circumstances of tonight's gathering, he felt it was imperative to intervene personally." Nathaniel found his voice first. "Searching for her? Cassandra's father abandoned her family. He disappeared and never looked back." William Sterling's expression darkened. "That's what I was told you believed, and I understand why, but the truth is far more complicated than that. Cassandra, your mother told me you had died. She said there had been an accident, that you and she had both been killed in a car crash. I spent 3 years grieving you before I learned the truth." My world tilted on its axis. "What?" "Your mother was struggling with addiction when we separated," he continued, his voice careful but clear. "I was trying to get custody, trying to get both of you the help you needed, but she disappeared one night, took you with her, and changed your names. By the time I tracked you down, she had convinced you that I had abandoned you both." Caroline Hartwell nodded, consulting her tablet again. "Mr. Sterling hired our firm to continue the search when other agencies reached dead ends. We finally located Cassandra 6 months ago, but Mr. Sterling wanted to approach the situation carefully given the sensitive nature of the family dynamics involved." 6 months ago? I whispered. My mind was racing, trying to process this information. The man I had spent my entire life hating for abandoning us had actually been looking for me, had thought I was dead? "I've been watching from a distance," William said, his voice gentle.
learning about the woman you've become, the work you do, the life you've built. I'm so proud of you, Cassandra. You've accomplished incredible things despite everything you went through.
Frederick cleared his throat, clearly struggling to regain control of the situation. This is all very touching, but I'm not sure what this has to do with our family discussion. Oh, but it has everything to do with your family discussion, Caroline Hartwell interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. You see, while Mr. Sterling was learning about his daughter's life, he also learned about the treatment she's been receiving from her husband's family, the accusations, the financial surveillance, the systematic emotional abuse. Vivian's face went white. Emotional abuse? That's a serious accusation and completely unfounded. Is it? William Sterling stepped closer to the table, and suddenly the room felt much smaller. Because from what I understand, you spent the evening calling my daughter a gold digger, questioning her motives for marrying your son, and threatening her with financial ruin if she doesn't accept your settlement offer. The silence that followed was deafening. The manila envelopes full of financial accusations suddenly looked less like evidence and more like weapons used against an innocent woman. Mr. Sterling, Frederick said, clearly trying to recover his footing, while I appreciate your concern for your daughter, this is really a private family matter. Actually, Caroline Hartwell said, consulting her tablet once more, it stopped being a private family matter the moment you began making threats and engaging in what could be considered financial intimidation. But more importantly, it stopped being a matter you could control the moment you decided to underestimate exactly who you were dealing with. She looked up from her tablet, her expression almost pitying. You see, Mr. Frederick Ashford, you've spent the evening trying to intimidate a woman whose father happens to be worth approximately $4.7 billion, and who is not particularly pleased with how her daughter has been treated. The room exploded into chaos as the full implications of this revelation hit the Ashford family like a tsunami. The silence that followed Caroline Hartwell's revelation stretched for what felt like an eternity. $4.7 billion. The number hung in the air like a thunderclap, reverberating through every carefully constructed assumption the Ashford family had built about me over the past 3 years. Frederick's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. Vivian had gone so pale I thought she might actually faint. Priscilla's phone slipped from her plate and clattered onto her plate, the sound unnaturally loud in the stunned quiet. William Sterling, my father, a concept my brain still couldn't fully process, moved closer to where I sat, his presence both comforting and surreal. I know this is overwhelming, Cassandra. I know you have questions, and I promise to answer every single one of them. But first, I think we need to address the immediate situation. He turned to face the Ashford family, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I've been listening from the foyer for the past 20 minutes, long enough to hear you reduce your daughter's marriage to a financial transaction, long enough to hear you threaten her with legal action and social destruction, long enough to hear you offer her money to disappear from your son's life. Montgomery, who had been silent since the revelation, finally found his voice. Mr. Sterling, sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We were simply trying to protect our family's interests. By systematically destroying a young woman's self-worth, by hiring investigators to dig into her medical records and financial history, by calculating the cost of her existence in your son's life? Caroline Hartwell stepped forward, pulling several documents from her briefcase. Actually, let's talk about investigations, shall we? Because while you were busy investigating Cassandra, Mr. Sterling was conducting his own research into your family. She spread the documents across the table with practiced efficiency. Did you know, for instance, that the Ashford Foundation, which you've been so proud of using to leverage social connections, is currently under investigation by the IRS for potential tax fraud? Something about inflated charitable deductions and money being funneled to for-profit ventures owned by family members? Frederick's face went from pale to gray. That's a routine audit, nothing more. Is it? Because according to our sources, the investigation has expanded to include potential violations of federal racketeering statutes.
Apparently, using a charitable foundation to launder money and evade taxes has attracted some unwanted attention from law enforcement. Vivienne grabbed her husband's arm. Frederick, what is she talking about? But Caroline wasn't finished. Then there's the matter of Ashford Industries' recent acquisition of land in Pennsylvania, the one where environmental impact reports were falsified and local officials were bribed to expedite permits. That's currently the subject of a federal grand jury investigation.
Reginald started to stand up, then thought better of it. You can't prove any of that. Actually, we can, William said quietly. Because when someone threatens my daughter, I tend to take a very close look at who's doing the threatening. And what I found was a family that's built their wealth on a foundation of fraud, tax evasion, and corruption. A family that's apparently been under federal investigation for the better part of 2 years. The room felt like it was spinning. The Ashford family, who had spent the evening positioning themselves as the moral authorities passing judgment on my character, were apparently criminals. The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. Caroline pulled out yet another document, but my personal favorite discovery was the SEC investigation into insider trading. It seems someone in the Ashford family has been making remarkably prescient stock trades based on information that wasn't publicly available. Information that could only have come from Frederick's position on several corporate boards. Frederick's composure finally cracked completely. This is extortion. You can't come into my home and make these accusations. Actually, we can, William said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades in boardrooms and courtrooms. Because these aren't accusations, Frederick. These are facts. And unlike your investigation into my daughter, our investigation was conducted by professionals who understand the law. Priscilla looked like she was going to be sick. What do you want? Money? We can pay you to make this go away. The laugh that escaped from William was cold and humorless. You want to pay me, the man whose daughter you've been systematically torturing for 3 years? The man whose child you've made to feel worthless and unwanted? You think this is about money? He walked around the table, stopping in front of each family member as he spoke. You investigated her financial history and found student loans that were paid off. What you didn't bother to learn was that those loans were paid from a trust fund I established when she was born. A fund she's never known existed because I wanted her to succeed on her own merits first. My head was reeling. A trust fund? He'd been taking care of me financially without my knowledge? You found it suspicious that her salary increased after marrying Nathaniel. What you didn't discover was that the Sunrise Community Center received a $10 million anonymous donation last year specifically because of the work my daughter has done there. The promotion and salary increase were based on merit, not nepotism. $10 million? I thought about all the programs we'd been able to expand, all the families we'd been able to help, all the elderly residents who now had better care. That had been him? You questioned her motives for accepting gifts and lifestyle upgrades, but you never questioned why a young woman who grew up in poverty might feel uncomfortable accepting expensive things or why she might need time to adjust to a different socioeconomic level. You saw manipulation where there was actually trauma and insecurity. Caroline Hartwell had been watching this exchange with the satisfaction of someone who had orchestrated many such revelations. Mr. Sterling, should we discuss the trust fund details? William nodded. Cassandra, the trust fund I mentioned contains approximately $50 million. It becomes fully accessible to you on your 35th birthday, but you can access portions of it now for any educational, charitable, or business ventures you choose to pursue. $50 million? The room started spinning again. The Ashford family had spent the evening calculating the cost of my marriage at $1.7 million, while I apparently had access to $50 million that I'd never known existed. There's also the matter of inheritance, Caroline added helpfully.
Mr. Sterling's will currently designates Cassandra as the primary beneficiary of his estate, which includes controlling interest in Sterling Enterprises, real estate holdings across 3 countries, and various investment portfolios. Nathaniel, who had been silent through most of this revelation, finally spoke. "Cassandra, did you know any of this?" I looked at him, tears streaming down my face. "I thought my father abandoned us. I thought he didn't love me. I've spent my entire adult life trying to prove I was worthy of love because I believed the one person who should have loved me unconditionally just walked away." The pain in his eyes was real, and I realized that he was grappling with his own betrayal, not just his family's treatment of me, but the fact that they had made him complicit in it.
William returned to my side, his expression gentle. "I need you to understand something, Cassandra. I never stopped loving you. I never stopped looking for you. And when I found you, when I saw the woman you'd become despite everything you'd been through, I was overwhelmed with pride. You didn't succeed because of money or connections or advantages. You succeeded because you're brilliant and compassionate and determined." He turned back to the Ashford family, his expression hardening. "Which is why watching you try to destroy her self-worth and convince her she's some kind of opportunist has been particularly difficult for me to witness." Caroline Hartwell checked her watch. "Mr. Sterling, we should probably discuss the next steps." "Yes," he said, never taking his eyes off Frederick. "The next steps. You see, Frederick, you made a critical error tonight. You threatened my daughter. You made her feel small and worthless and unwanted. And now you're going to learn what happens when you target someone who has the resources to fight back." The Ashford family sat frozen, finally understanding that they had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They had tried to intimidate someone they assumed was powerless, only to discover that she was anything but. And now they were about to face the consequences of that mistake. William Sterling moved to the head of the dining table with the casual authority of someone who had commanded boardrooms for decades. The Ashfords, who minutes ago had been the ones controlling the conversation, now sat like defendants awaiting sentencing. "Caroline," he said, his voice carrying the tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "I think it's time we presented the evidence we've gathered." Caroline Hartwell opened her briefcase with surgical precision, removing what appeared to be dozens of documents, photographs, and electronic devices. She arranged them on the table with the methodical care of someone building an airtight case. "Let's start with the harassment campaign," she said, pulling out a thick folder. "Mr. Sterling's security team has been monitoring the situation since we located Cassandra 6 months ago. We have documented every family gathering where she was systematically excluded, every joke made at her expense, every deliberate attempt to make her feel unwelcome." She opened the folder to reveal photographs, candid shots of family events I barely remembered. But seeing them now, from an outside perspective, the body language was unmistakable. In every image, I was positioned slightly apart from the group, my posture defensive, my smile forced. The Ashford family members were captured in moments of barely concealed disdain, whispered conversations, and meaningful glances. "This photo was taken at last Christmas," Caroline continued, pointing to one particularly telling image. "Notice how Mrs. Ashford positioned herself between Cassandra and the family portrait setup, effectively excluding her from the formal photos. And this one from Easter dinner shows Mr. Reginald Ashford deliberately moving place cards to seat Cassandra at the far end of the table, isolated from the main conversation." Vivian's face was burning red. "Those were simple oversights, not deliberate." "Were they?"
Caroline pulled out another set of documents. Because we also have the text message chains, the group family text where Cassandra's name was deliberately excluded from event planning, the private messages between family members making crude jokes about her background, the coordinated efforts to ensure she felt like an outsider. My stomach dropped. They had group chats about me. They had been actively working to exclude me, and I'd been too naive to realize it. William's expression grew darker as Caroline continued her presentation. Then there's the financial surveillance. You hired Davidson Investigations to conduct background checks on my daughter. What you didn't realize is that Davidson Investigations has been under federal investigation for illegal access to private records. Every search they conducted on Cassandra's behalf has been documented and logged as evidence in that federal case. Frederick's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. We had every right to protect our family's interests by accessing medical records illegally. Caroline's voice cut through his protest like a scalpel. By bribing a clerk at the county records office to access sealed documents from Cassandra's childhood, by paying for unauthorized credit reports and employment background checks. That's not protection, Mr. Ashford. That's stalking. She pulled out a recording device and placed it in the center of the table. But perhaps most damning is tonight's conversation. Mr. Sterling's security team has been monitoring this gathering with Cassandra's safety in mind. We have audio recordings of everything that's been said in this room for the past 2 hours. The blood drained from Priscilla's face. You can't record private conversations without consent. Actually, we can. Because Cassandra consented to the monitoring for her own protection. And since she was a participant in every conversation, the recordings are completely legal. Caroline pressed a button on the device, and suddenly Reginald's voice filled the room. Let's just call it what it is. Gold digging. It's not exactly uncommon, and frankly, Cassandra, we're not blind.
The sound of his own words seemed to physically pain him. Around the table, the other family members shifted uncomfortably as they heard their voices played back, their cruelty preserved in perfect digital clarity. We have 2 hours of this, Caroline said matter-of-factly. 2 hours of a coordinated psychological attack on a young woman whose only crime was falling in love with your son. 2 hours of threats, intimidation, and emotional abuse. William walked behind my chair, placing a protective hand on my shoulder. But what really concerns me is the pattern of behavior this represents. Because this isn't just about tonight, is it? This is about 3 years of systematic attempts to drive my daughter away. Caroline pulled out yet another folder. The restaurant incident last spring, where Mrs. Ashford called ahead to cancel Cassandra's reservation and then expressed surprise that the table wasn't available. The charity gala, where someone accidentally provided Cassandra with the wrong dress code information, ensuring she would be inappropriately dressed. The business dinner, where Mr. Frederick Ashford told potential investors that his son's wife was still finding her way in polite society. Each revelation hit like a physical blow. I remembered every incident, had chalked them up to misunderstandings or my own social awkwardness. Now I realized they had been deliberate sabotage. You documented everything, I whispered, looking up at my father with wonder and growing recognition of the protective love I'd never known I had. The moment I found you, I started protecting you, he said simply. I've lost 26 years of your life. I wasn't going to lose any more to people who wanted to hurt you. Frederick made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Mr. Sterling, surely we can discuss this like reasonable adults. Perhaps there's been some miscommunication about our family's intentions. Miscommunication. William's laugh was cold and sharp. You mean like the miscommunication where you threatened to use your legal connections to make my daughter's life very, very difficult if she didn't accept your settlement offer? We have that on tape too, Frederick. Caroline was now spreading financial documents across the table. Speaking of settlements, let's discuss your family's actual financial position, shall we? Because while you were calculating the cost of Cassandra's marriage, Mr. Sterling's forensic accountants were calculating the cost of your criminal activities.
The document showed a complex web of financial transactions, shell companies, and offshore accounts. Even I could see that something was very wrong with the Ashford family's financial picture. The tax fraud alone carries potential penalties of $50 million, Caroline continued conversationally. The environmental violations could result in another $30 million in fines. And the SEC violations, well, those could result in criminal charges and the complete forfeiture of assets obtained through illegal trading. Vivian was now openly sobbing. We didn't mean for it to go this far. We were just protecting our family. By destroying mine? William's voice remained calm, but there was ice underneath. You want to know what real wealth looks like, Frederick? It's not just the money. It's the power to protect the people you love. It's the resources to investigate threats and neutralize them. It's the ability to ensure that justice is served when someone hurts your family. Caroline checked her watch. Mr. Sterling, the federal agents will be here in approximately 15 minutes. The words hit the room like a bomb. Federal agents? Tonight? You see, William continued, his voice never rising above conversational tone. While you were busy planning your little intervention tonight, I was busy coordinating with federal law enforcement. The investigations into your family's activities have been accelerated, and arrest warrants have been issued. Frederick stood up so quickly, his chair fell backward. We can't do this. We have rights. We have lawyers. You have the right to remain silent, Caroline said pleasantly, which I'd recommend exercising because everything you say from this point forward will likely be used as evidence in federal court. Priscilla was hyperventilating now. This is insane. We're not criminals. We're a respected family. You were a respected family, William corrected, right up until you decided to target my daughter. Now you're a family under federal indictment for tax fraud, environmental crimes, securities violations, and conspiracy charges. The sound of vehicles pulling into the driveway filtered through the dining room. Car door slamming, footsteps on gravel, the low murmur of official voices coordinating their approach. The cavalry has arrived, Caroline observed with satisfaction. And as the doorbell rang for what would be the final time that evening, I realized that my entire world had changed in the span of 2 hours. The family that had spent years making me feel small and worthless was about to be led away in handcuffs, while the father I thought had abandoned me was orchestrating their downfall with the precision of a master chess player. Justice, it turned out, had been planning its arrival all along.
The doorbell's chime was followed immediately by a firm, authoritative knock that made the crystal stemware on the table tremble. Through the dining room windows, I could see the unmistakable flash of blue and red lights painting the manicured grounds of the Riverside Estate in alternating colors of justice. Caroline Hartwell moved toward the foyer with practiced efficiency. I'll handle the introductions, she said, her voice carrying the tone of someone who had orchestrated many such moments. Mr. Sterling, perhaps you'd like to stay with Cassandra while I coordinate with the agents? As her footsteps echoed down the hallway, the Ashford family sat in stunned silence, the weight of their situation finally sinking in. The manila envelopes full of financial accusations against me now seemed pathetically insignificant compared to the federal charges about to rain down on them. Within moments, Caroline returned, followed by what appeared to be an entire task force. The lead agent was a woman in her 40s, wearing a navy windbreaker with FBI emblazoned across the chest. Behind her came agents from what I would later learn were the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Good evening, the lead FBI agent said, her voice professional but not unkind. I'm Special Agent Rebecca Morrison. We have federal warrants for the arrest of Frederick James Ashford, Vivian Catherine Ashford, Priscilla Ashford Montgomery, and Reginald William Ashford. The words seemed to echo in the suddenly silent room. I watched as each named family member processed the reality that their carefully constructed world was about to collapse entirely. Frederick made one last attempt at the authority he'd wielded just minutes before. This is outrageous. I demand to speak with my attorney immediately. You have no right to disrupt a private family gathering. Actually, sir, we have every right, Agent Morrison replied calmly, producing a thick stack of official documents.
These are federal arrest warrants issued by the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. You are being charged with conspiracy to commit tax fraud, securities fraud, environmental crimes, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. She began reading from the warrants with the methodical precision of someone who had done this countless times. Frederick James Ashford, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the United States Treasury, filing false tax returns, and operating an illegal money laundering scheme through the Ashford Foundation. As Agent Morrison continued reading rights and charges, other agents moved efficiently through the room, documenting everything with cameras and placing evidence markers on various items. The elaborate Thanksgiving dinner, with its crystal and china and golden linens, was being transformed into a crime scene. Vivian's composure finally shattered completely. "This isn't happening," she kept repeating, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. "This can't be happening. We're pillars of the community. We donate to charity. We go to church." One of the IRS agents, a stern man with graying temples, looked up from his documentation. "Ma'am, the Ashford Foundation's charitable donations are part of the fraud investigation. Our analysis shows that over 60% of claimed charitable deductions were actually payments to for-profit entities controlled by your family members." Caroline Hartwell stood beside my father, consulting her tablet as the arrests proceeded. "Agent Morrison, I believe you'll find the audio recordings particularly useful for the conspiracy charges. We have clear evidence of coordination between family members to conceal assets and obstruct previous investigations." Agent Morrison nodded. "Miss Hartwell, we'll need those recordings as part of our evidence package. Mr. Sterling, thank you for your cooperation with this investigation." My father's expression was grim, but satisfied. "Agent Morrison, I want to be clear that my daughter had no knowledge of any of these activities. She's been a victim of this family's manipulation, not a participant in their crimes." "That's been made very clear in our investigation, sir. In fact, our financial analysis shows that Mrs. Cassandra Ashford has been completely isolated from any knowledge of the illegal activities. Her financial records are remarkably clean and transparent." As the agents continued their work, I found myself watching Nathaniel, who sat frozen in his chair, staring at his hands. The man I'd married, the man I thought I'd known, was watching his entire family being arrested for federal crimes. The weight of what this meant for our relationship was just beginning to settle over me. "Nathaniel," Agent Morrison said, consulting her documents, "at this time you're not being charged with any crimes. Our investigation indicates that you were not involved in the financial schemes and were deliberately excluded from knowledge of the illegal activities." Relief flooded his face, but it was quickly replaced by something else: horror at the realization of what his family had been doing without his knowledge. Priscilla was handcuffed now, her earlier confidence replaced by desperate panic. "Nathaniel, call our lawyers, call everyone. This is all a mistake. Tell them it's a mistake."
But Nathaniel just stared at her, his voice hollow when he finally spoke. "Is it a mistake, Priscilla? Because looking back now, there were signs. The mysterious business meetings Dad wouldn't discuss, the sudden influx of cash when the stock market was down. The way you all acted like you had some secret knowledge that I wasn't privy to." An EPA agent approached the table, placing evidence bags around what appeared to be Frederick's phone and several documents. "Sir, we'll need to seize all electronic devices and financial records. This includes phones, computers, tablets, and any physical documents related to business or financial activities." Frederick's face went ashen. "You can't take my phone. I have important business." "Sir, your important business is now evidence in a federal criminal investigation," the agent replied matter-of-factly. As each family member was read their rights and led away in handcuffs, the enormity of what had just happened began to sink in. The people who had spent the evening dismantling my self-worth, who had calculated the cost of my existence in their son's life, who had threatened to destroy me financially and socially, were now facing decades in federal prison. Carolyn moved to stand beside me as the last of the arrestees was led away. "Cassandra, there's a few things you should know about the evidence we've collected. The financial surveillance they conducted on you was far more extensive than what they revealed tonight. They had been monitoring your bank accounts, your credit cards, your employment records, even your medical appointments. My stomach turned. They were watching everything? Everything, William confirmed, his voice tight with controlled anger. They knew about every purchase you made, every doctor's appointment you scheduled, every day you called in sick to work. They were building a profile to use against you whenever they decided the time was right. Agent Morrison approached us as the last of her team finished documenting the scene. Mr. Sterling, the arraignments are scheduled for Monday morning. Given the nature of the charges and the flight risk assessment, it's unlikely any of them will be granted bail. Flight risk? I asked. The family has significant offshore assets and international connections. Plus, the severity of the charges means they're looking at potential sentences of 20 to 30 years each. That tends to make people consider leaving the country. As the last of the federal agents left the house, an eerie quiet settled over the dining room. The elaborate Thanksgiving feast sat untouched, the evidence of a celebration that had turned into a reckoning. Nathaniel and I were alone with my father and Carolyn, surrounded by the wreckage of an evening that had changed everything. What happens now? I asked, my voice small in the sudden silence. William placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Now, my dear daughter, you get to decide what kind of life you want to build, free from their influence, free from their judgment, free from their attempts to make you feel small. But as I looked at Nathaniel, sitting in shocked silence among the ruins of his family legacy, I realized that freedom was going to be more complicated than my father made it sound. The truth had been revealed. Justice was being served, but the cost of that justice was going to reach far beyond the people who deserved to pay it.
Protecting him so he could inherit a clean company while they did the dirty work, Caroline added, ending her call and rejoining our conversation. It's a common pattern in family businesses involved in illegal activities. Keep the heir apparent clean while the older generation handles the compromising activities. Nathaniel looked sick. 3 years. For 3 years, I watched them treat you badly, and I thought it was just, I don't know, social prejudice? Old-fashioned classism? I kept thinking they'd warm up to you eventually, that they just needed time to see what I saw in you. But you never stood up to them, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. Not really. You'd protest, but you'd never actually confront them. You'd never walk away from a family dinner or refuse to tolerate their behavior. The accusation hung between us like a physical barrier. Nathaniel's face crumpled slightly, and I could see the truth of it hitting him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I was a coward. I told myself I was playing the long game, that I could change their minds, gradually. But the truth is, I was afraid of losing them, afraid of being cut off from the family, from the business, from everything I thought my life was supposed to be." Caroline consulted her tablet, her expression businesslike. "Nathaniel, there are some legal realities you need to understand. With your parents and siblings facing federal charges, there will likely be asset forfeiture proceedings. The family's wealth, including the company and most of the real estate, could be seized as proceeds of criminal activity." The color drained from his face. "Everything?" "Potentially everything," she confirmed. "The government tends to be very aggressive in RICO cases. They'll trace every dollar back to its source, and if they can prove that assets were purchased with money from illegal activities, those assets can be forfeited." My father moved away from the window, his footsteps echoing in the now empty room. "Nathaniel, I want to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Did you marry my daughter because you loved her, or because she made you feel like a better person than your family was teaching you to be?" The question was blunt, almost cruel, but I found myself holding my breath as I waited for the answer. It was something I'd wondered about myself, whether Nathaniel had been drawn to me precisely because I represented everything his family wasn't. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands folded on the table. "Both," he said finally. "I love her, completely.
But you're right that she made me feel like I could be better than what I was raised to be. Being with Cassandra made me feel like I was the person I wanted to be, instead of the person my family expected me to be. And now, William pressed, now that your family's expectations are no longer a factor, now that their influence has been removed from your life permanently. I don't know, Nathaniel admitted, his voice breaking slightly. I don't know who I am without their approval or their disapproval. I don't know what my life looks like without the company, without the family money, without the social position I've had since birth. Caroline's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it with a frown. The media has gotten wind of the arrests. There are already news vans gathering outside the estate gates. We should probably discuss how to handle the publicity. The thought of reporters and cameras and public scrutiny made my stomach clench. What will they say about me? Probably that you're the gold-digging wife who brought down a prominent family. The narrative is too juicy for them to resist. Beautiful young woman marries wealthy man, his family gets arrested for federal crimes. They'll paint you as either the victim or the villain, depending on which story sells better. William's expression darkened. Not if I have anything to say about it. I've dealt with media management for decades. The story they'll get is the truth, that my daughter was targeted and harassed by a criminal family who didn't want their illegal activities exposed. But that raises another question, Caroline continued, her voice gentle but probing. Cassandra, what do you want to happen now? You have choices that you didn't have this morning. You have resources, you have protection, and you have a father who's prepared to support whatever decision you make. I looked around the dining room that had been the scene of so much pain and revelation. The elaborate place settings, the crystal stemware, the carefully arranged flowers, all of it felt like props in a play I no longer wanted to be part of. I want to go home, I said finally, to my real home. To my apartment, my job, my life. I want to help the people at the community center who actually need help, not sit in rooms like this being judged by people who think charity work is a hobby. Nathaniel's face fell. What about us? What about our marriage?
It was the question I'd been dreading, the one I wasn't sure I was ready to answer. I don't know, Nathaniel. I love you, but I'm not sure I know who you are when you're not trying to please your family or rebel against them, and I'm not sure you know either. Caroline gathered her documents, preparing to leave. There's no rush to make any permanent decisions tonight. The legal proceedings will take months, possibly years. You'll have time to figure out what you want your life to look like. But as I sat in that dining room, surrounded by the remnants of an evening that had changed everything, I already knew what I wanted. I wanted the life I'd been building before I'd gotten swept up in the Ashford family drama. I wanted my work, my independence, my sense of purpose. The only question was whether that life had room for a man who was still figuring out who he was without his family's money and influence to define him. Outside, the media vans were gathering, ready to tell their version of the story. But for the first time in 3 years, I didn't care what story they'd told. I knew who I was, and that was enough. The media circus outside had grown into a full-scale feeding frenzy by the time Caroline's security team prepared to escort us from the estate. Through the mansion's front windows, I could see satellite trucks from major news networks, reporters setting up cameras, and photographers with telephoto lenses trying to capture images through the windows. The story of the Ashford family's downfall was already spreading across social media and cable news. But it was the deeper investigation that Caroline and William had conducted that truly revealed the scope of what had been happening in my marriage. As we waited for the security convoy to arrive, Caroline opened one final folder, the one that contained the most damning evidence of all. Cassandra, there's something else you need to see, she said, her voice carrying a gravity that made my stomach clench. Our investigation into the family's harassment of you revealed something that goes beyond what happened tonight. She spread a series of documents across the coffee table and what had been the mansion's formal living room. Bank statements, phone records, email printouts, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs. For the past 18 months, the Ashford family has been planning what they called the Cassandra problem, Caroline began, pointing to a printed email chain. These communications show a systematic campaign designed not just to make you feel unwelcome, but to create legal grounds for either divorce proceedings or a competency challenge. My blood went cold. Competency challenge? William's jaw tightened as he looked at the documents. They were building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent based on your anxiety medication and therapy sessions. The plan was to use your medical records, which they obtained illegally, to argue that you were not capable of making rational financial decisions. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. The anxiety medication I'd been prescribed specifically because of their treatment was being weaponized against me. The therapy sessions where I'd worked through my feelings of inadequacy and self-doubt were being twisted into evidence of mental instability. Nathaniel stood up abruptly, his face pale with horror. "That's impossible. My family wouldn't. They couldn't." "They could, and they did," Caroline said, showing him a printed email with her mother's name in the sender field. This email, dated 6 months ago, discusses hiring a psychiatrist who would be willing to evaluate you and provide the diagnosis they needed. She pulled out another document, and this one, from your father to a family law attorney, outlines a strategy for having Cassandra's marriage annulled on grounds of mental incompetence, which would void any claims she might have to marital assets. The room was spinning. I sat down heavily, trying to process what I was hearing. Not only had they been planning to destroy me emotionally and socially, but they had been building a legal strategy to have me declared mentally incompetent and strip me of any legal rights in my own marriage. "There's more," Caroline continued, her voice gentle but relentless. "The surveillance we documented wasn't just about gathering information. They were also manipulating situations to trigger your anxiety responses, then documenting those responses as evidence of instability." She showed me photographs I'd never seen before, images of me having panic attacks in parking lots, crying in my car after family events, looking distressed and overwhelmed in public spaces. Someone had been following me, documenting my worst moments, building a portfolio of my pain. The restaurant reservation that was mysteriously canceled? That was deliberate, designed to create a public scene of disappointment and frustration. The charity gala where you were given the wrong dress code? They wanted you to feel humiliated and out of place, and they wanted to document your reaction.
William was pacing now, his controlled demeanor cracking under the weight of what had been done to his daughter. They were systematically destroying her mental health, then planning to use that destruction as evidence that she was unfit to be married to their son. Nathaniel sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I knew Mom had strong opinions about our marriage, but this is sociopathic. This is criminal." "Actually, it is criminal," Caroline confirmed. "Conspiracy to commit fraud, stalking, illegal surveillance, obtaining medical records through fraudulent means, the list goes on. But more than that, it's a level of calculated cruelty that goes beyond simple family disapproval." She pulled out one final document that made my heart stop. It was a draft of a press release, already written and apparently ready to be distributed. "This was found on Priscilla's computer," Caroline said. "It's a statement they had prepared to release to the media after they succeeded in having you declared incompetent. It portrays you as a mentally unstable woman who manipulated their beloved son and positions the family as victims who tried to help but were ultimately forced to take legal action for everyone's protection." Reading my own character assassination, written in advance by people who had never bothered to actually know me, was perhaps the most chilling moment of the entire evening. They hadn't just wanted to get rid of me, they had wanted to destroy my reputation so thoroughly that I would never recover from it. The timeline shows they were planning to execute the strategy within the next month. The psychiatric evaluation was scheduled for next week, the legal papers were already drawn up, the media campaign was ready to launch. Nathaniel looked up from his hands, his eyes red with what might have been tears. "Cassandra, I swear to you, I had no idea. If I had known, if I had even suspected—" "What would you have done?" I asked, my voice hollow. "Would you have chosen me over them? Really? Or would you have found a way to rationalize it, to convince yourself they were trying to help?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, and I could see from his expression that he wasn't sure of the answer. That uncertainty told me everything I needed to know about our marriage. William stopped pacing and came to sit beside me.
Cassandra, there's something else you should know. The reason I accelerated the federal investigation, the reason I moved so quickly tonight, it's because we intercepted communications suggesting they were planning to escalate their timeline. My stomach dropped. Escalate how? Caroline pulled out a printed text message exchange. They were discussing the possibility of having you involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. They had identified a facility that would accept patients based on family testimony alone. No independent medical evaluation required. The words hit me like a physical blow. Involuntary commitment. They had been planning to have me locked up in a psychiatric facility based on lies and manipulation, probably while Nathaniel was away on a business trip and couldn't intervene. "That's kidnapping," I whispered. "Yes, it is," William said grimly, "which is why we moved tonight. We couldn't risk letting them execute that plan." The full scope of what had been planned for me was almost incomprehensible. Not just social humiliation or financial pressure, but actual imprisonment based on fabricated evidence of mental illness. They had been willing to destroy my freedom, my reputation, and my sanity to protect their family's image and wealth. Nathaniel was crying now, openly weeping, as the reality of his family's true nature finally hit him. "I'm so sorry, Cassandra. I'm so incredibly sorry. I should have protected you. I should have seen what they were doing." But even his tears couldn't change the fundamental truth that was becoming clear to me. I had married a man who loved me, but who had never truly stood up for me when it mattered. And now I had to decide if love without protection was enough to build a life on. Outside, the media circus continued to grow, but inside the mansion, a different kind of reckoning was taking place. The full extent of the Ashford family's conspiracy had been revealed, and with it, the true cost of the life I had been trying to build in their shadow. The question now was whether any part of that life was worth saving. The security convoy finally arrived at midnight. Black SUVs with tinted windows that would shield us from the army of cameras waiting outside the estate's gates. As we prepared to leave, I found myself taking one last look around the mansion that had been the stage for so much pain and revelation. Caroline had finished briefing the media specialists who had handled the narrative in the coming days. The story would focus on my victimization and my father's protective response, casting the Ashford family as the criminals they had proven themselves to be. But even the promise of vindication felt hollow compared to the weight of everything I had learned. "The convoy will take you to a secure location tonight," Caroline explained as we gathered our belongings. "Tomorrow, you can decide where you want to go from here, literally and figuratively."
William stood beside me, and for the first time in hours, his expression had softened from the steel-hard determination of a man orchestrating justice to something more vulnerable, a father who had found his daughter only to discover how much she had suffered in his absence. "Cassandra," he said quietly, "I know this is overwhelming. I know you have every reason to be angry with me for not finding you sooner, for not protecting you from all of this." I looked at this man who was still largely a stranger to me, despite sharing my DNA and apparently my stubborn streak. "I'm not angry with you, I'm grateful, but I'm also terrified of becoming dependent on someone else's power to define my worth. I spent 3 years letting the Ashfords make me feel small. I can't spend the next 3 years letting your wealth make me feel significant." He nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "What do you want then? What would make you feel like yourself again?" The answer came to me with startling clarity. "I want to go back to work. I want to help Mrs. Patterson with her Thanksgiving leftovers and make sure the heating system at the center is working properly. I want to review grant applications and argue with the city council about funding. I want my life back, the life I built before I got swept up in all of this." Nathaniel, who had been standing apart from our conversation, stepped closer. "What about us? What about our marriage?" I turned to face him, this man I had loved enough to endure 3 years of his family's cruelty, the man who had given me beautiful gifts and spoken beautiful words, but who had never quite found the courage to truly choose me over their approval. "I don't know, Nathaniel. I love you, I probably always will, but I need to figure out who I am when I'm not constantly defending my right to exist in your world. And you need to figure out who you are when you're not caught between your family and your wife." His face crumpled with the pain of recognition. Are you asking for a divorce? I'm asking for space, time, the chance to breathe without wondering if someone is documenting my breathing patterns as evidence of instability. I reached out and touched his hand gently. The man I fell in love with was kind and generous and made me laugh. But he was also someone who let his family plan to have me institutionalized rather than risk confronting them. I need to understand how both of those things can be true. William watched this exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood that some battles couldn't be fought with money or lawyers or federal investigations. Some battles had to be fought alone, in the quiet spaces of the heart where love and self-respect either coexisted or destroyed each other. As we walked toward the convoy, I felt the weight of the evening settling over me like a heavy coat. The Ashford family was facing decades in federal prison. Their wealth would likely be forfeited, their reputation destroyed, their criminal conspiracy exposed to the world. Justice had been served with a precision and thoroughness that would have been impossible without my father's resources and determination. But justice, I was learning, was different from healing. Justice was what happened in courtrooms and headlines. Healing was what happened in the quiet moments afterward, when you had to decide who you wanted to be in the wake of betrayal. The media frenzy outside the gates was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, and the convoy had to push through a sea of people desperate for a glimpse of the woman at the center of the Ashford scandal. But inside the bulletproof glass of the SUV, I felt strangely calm. For 3 years, I had lived under the shadow of people who wanted me to disappear. Now, ironically, the entire world wanted to see me. But neither the hatred nor the attention felt like it belonged to me. They were both reactions to a story. The gold digger, the victim, the billionaire's daughter, the woman who brought down a criminal empire. None of those labels captured who I actually was. As we drove through the night toward whatever came next, I found myself thinking about Mrs. Patterson alone in her room at the community center on Thanksgiving night, about the grant application sitting on my desk that could fund a new job training program, about the broken heater in the East Wing that needed to be fixed before winter really set in. These were the things that mattered to me, the work that gave my life meaning, not because it was humble or virtuous, but because it was mine, because I had built it with my own hands and heart, without anyone's permission or approval. My father sat beside me in the convoy, occasionally answering calls from lawyers and security coordinators, orchestrating the complex aftermath of the evening's events. At one point, he hung up and turned to me.
I've established a legal defense fund for any lawsuits that might arise from tonight's events, he said. And there's a media relations team standing by to handle any attacks on your character. You're protected now, Cassandra. No one will ever be able to hurt you the way they did again. I smiled at him, this powerful man who was trying so hard to make up for 26 years of absence with an overwhelming display of protective force. Thank you. But I don't want to be someone who needs that much protection. I want to be someone who's strong enough to protect herself. He studied my face in the dim light of the convoy. You are. You survived 3 years of psychological warfare that would have broken most people. You never let them convince you that you were what they said you were. That's not weakness, Cassandra. That's extraordinary strength. Maybe he was right. Maybe surviving was its own form of victory, even when it didn't feel like winning. The convoy eventually delivered us to a luxury hotel in the city, where I would spend the night in a suite that probably cost more than most people made in a month. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The legal proceedings, the media management, the slow process of rebuilding a life in the aftermath of betrayal. But tonight, as I stood at the window looking out at the city lights, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Peace. Not happiness, not yet, but the deep quiet that comes when the fight is finally over and you've discovered you're still standing. The Ashford family had tried to erase me, to reduce me to a problem that could be solved with money and manipulation. Instead, they had given me something infinitely more valuable, the absolute certainty of my own worth. I was Cassandra Wells, daughter of William Sterling, survivor of psychological warfare, protector of elderly residents, and advocate for people society had forgotten. I was a woman who had been tested by cruelty and had emerged with her kindness intact. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like more than enough. The gold digger narrative would follow me for a while, probably forever in some circles, but I knew the truth now. I wasn't the one who had been digging for gold. I was the one who had found it, buried deep within myself, and no amount of external wealth or poverty could change its value. The woman who had sat at that Thanksgiving table, desperately trying to prove her worth to people who had already decided she was worthless, was gone. In her place stood someone who knew, with absolute certainty, that her worth had never been up for debate. And that knowledge, I realized, was the most valuable inheritance my father could have given me. Not the money, not the protection, not the power to destroy those who had hurt me, but the reminder that I had always been worthy of love. I had just been looking for it in the wrong places.